This is S𝗨𝗣𝗣𝗥𝗧, Germany, an enclave for Germany's ultra-wealthy. It's located just south of Munich in the foothills of the German Alps. Here in this lakeside district, you'll find the most millionaires per capita, 428 per 100,000 taxpayers. In fact, it is so wealthy there that the locals often joke that there are more yachts here than unemployed people. It's been the playplace of monarchs and the stomping grounds of wealthy aristocrats and tech moguls alike. Yeah, but the majority of Germans don't live there, nor do they live in communities that even look like this. They actually live in communities that look like this. And that's often the trouble when comparing the wealth and cost of living from one country to another. When factoring in data and statistics, you have to account for the extreme ends of the spectrum, the very wealthy and the very poor. So I really wanted to know, what is the middle class anyway? What do they look like in Germany and the United States? How much do they earn? And importantly, since earnings don't really tell the whole picture of financial stability, when you account for things like savings, debt, assets, and liabilities, how much is the middle class actually worth? How do they live? And what does that look like now and for the future of the middle class? So, let's take a look. Being in the middle class is a pretty comfortable place to be in most societies. But what does it actually mean to be middle class in the United States and in Germany? Well, it depends. The middle class is a complex societal construct that actually has no unique definition. Indicators used to define and study the middle class vary significantly within and across disciplines. Some measures and indicators are based on occupation and employment status, relating, for example, to certain aspects of job quality. But others are based on social, cultural, or economic criteria such as income level, educational attainment, as well as virtues and attitudes. Yet other definitions are actually consumption-based, with households being defined as middle class if they're able to buy a home or afford a certain type of car or holiday. Listen, there are a lot of ways that you can measure and analyze the middle class. It's an imperfect analysis, but in my humble opinion, I think the best working definition for this video is the one that's actually employed by the Pew Research Center, as well as the OECD. So for international comparisons, they define the middle class as those earning between 75% and twice the median household income. In 2022, this median household income in the United States was $74,580, according to the US Census Bureau. That means that American households earning as little as just under $56,000, but up to nearly $150,000 are technically in the middle class. For the same year in Germany, the median household income was just above 42,000 euros, according to Status. That means that German households earning as little as 31,644 euros and up to 84,384 euros are technically middle class. As you can see from this graphic, the bulk of the population is part of this middle class group in almost all OECD countries. And across the OECD, almost 2 in 3 people actually belong to this middle income group in 2018. In Germany, the share was actually slightly higher at 64%. And you'll find that in many Central and Eastern European and in the Nordic countries, this middle income group is larger than in Germany, while it's smaller in many English-speaking Southern European, Latin American, and Asian OECD countries, such as, for example, in the United States, where only 51% of the population actually fits into this group. But here's where I think things get actually really interesting from a social perspective, because an alternative way to define the middle class is actually by examining those who self-describe themselves as being middle class. On average, around 2/3 of the population in OECD countries consider themselves as belonging to the middle class. In Germany, 73% of people self-identify as middle class, around 10% more than those who technically belong to this group according to the most widely used income categorization. And in some countries, this gap between who identifies as middle class and who technically is middle class is even wider. In the United States, for example, up to 87% of Americans identify as middle class, but again, only 51% are actually middle class, if you use the income-based definition, of course. And the fact that so many people self-identify as middle class, even though their socioeconomic situation would seem to suggest otherwise, is something that is known as middle class bias. So why does this happen? One reason can be that people compare themselves to their immediate peer group. So family members, neighbors, and coworkers who tend to have a similar living standard, rather than necessarily looking at living standards across society more broadly. And often we find that in the United States, Americans will typically define being rich as somebody who's just simply richer than me. But generally speaking, I think a lot of this also probably boils down to the fact that a lot of people tend to think of the middle class. It may actually be that they feel their personal income does not provide what they thought a middle class life should be. A life that actually can be remarkably hard to achieve. But I want to back up just a little bit here, because one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this subject in particular was because defining and categorizing the middle class can actually be a great litmus test for other economic and societal factors that are going on within a country. For starters, the size of a country's middle income group closely relates to the level of income inequality. This is because income groups are defined using thresholds expressed relative to this median income. In OECD countries where inequalities are large, such as Mexico, Chile, and the United States, incomes are widely dispersed around this median, and the middle income group is consequently smallest. Meanwhile, in more egalitarian countries, such as in Central, Northern, and Eastern Europe, a greater share of households live on incomes close to the median, and the middle income group is larger. But one of the things that I think is just as interesting as income inequality is educational inequality, and just how intrinsically linked these two things are. I mean, I'm not the first person to say this, but for quite some time now, a bachelor's degree has really become kind of the new high school diploma when it comes to minimum educational standards that tend to open up the most doors from an income and job security standpoint. In the United States, about half, or a little more, of adults with either some college education or a high school diploma were in the middle class in 2021. But this group, along with those with less than a high school diploma, experienced notable drops in their middle class shares from 1971 to 2021, and notable increases in the shares in the lower income tier. In Germany, however, things look actually a little bit different. Adults with upper secondary or post-secondary non-tertiary education remain the backbone of the middle income group. By the way, that definition is very heavy linguistically speaking, so many of you might be wondering, what exactly does post-secondary non-tertiary education actually mean? Well, they're basically talking about somebody who would have a high school diploma or equivalent. So in Germany, this is going to mean somebody who did graduate from Gymnasium, Realschule, Hauptschule, Gesamtschule. They probably received a certificate in some sort of technical or trade skill, but they did not go on to get tertiary education, which tends to mean a bachelor's degree from a university. Okay, but back to the data. In 2018, this group accounted for 58% of all middle-income adults. 33% of adults in the middle-income group had completed tertiary education. A small minority, the remaining 9%, had less than upper secondary education. The change has not been as dramatic as it has been in the United States. But don't get me wrong, the middle class, which was once the strong backbone of both economies in Germany and the United States, has steadily contracted for the past 50 years. Yet it seems that there is widespread belief in, or perhaps nostalgia about, the middle class. Is this entirely misguided? Well, getting to the bottom of what we think the middle class is versus what it actually is can be tricky. And when it comes to understanding the middle class and the economic factors on a global scale, it isn't always clear on what is working and who is benefiting, especially depending on which information you consume. That's why I always use our sponsor, Ground News, an app and website that gives me an easy, data-driven, and objective way to read the news. On Ground News, every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of political bias, factuality, and the ownership of sources reporting. The bias ratings and factuality score are assessed from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, this recent story on the health of the global economy, according to a World Bank report, was covered by over 60 news outlets. For this story, left-leaning publications emphasized the negative impact of the global economy's slowdown on achieving the 2030 UN Development Goals, using loaded language like wretched and broken promises, while the right-leaning publications warn of the negative consequences of wasted economic opportunities and the risk of a global recession, using loaded language like risk persistent inflation and slumping trade to emphasize a negative outlook. Same story, but different perspectives. That's why Ground News is an important tool to help us make informed decisions. If one side of the political spectrum is ignoring a story, the blind spot feed will let you know so you can make up your own mind about how reliable the reporting is. So go head over to ground.news/Ashton to check it out. You can subscribe through my link to get 30% off unlimited access to the Vantage subscription, which is what I use. When you subscribe, you not only support me, but you're also supporting an independent platform trying to make the news a little bit more transparent. But like I said earlier on in the video, income isn't the only way to analyze or identify the middle class. And especially when you're making an international comparison, it might not even necessarily be the best way to conceptualize what it means to be middle class in a particular country. What I think might be a better tool for understanding is to take a look at the net worth of someone living in the middle class. What does their safety net look like? How much have they saved for the future? And what kind of assets do they hold? After all, you can make a lot of money and still be broke. For example, younger workers may have a high flow of income but low levels of wealth. But on the flip side of things, some may not be bringing in middle-class incomes, but they may have a lot of savings or investments, and this is particularly true for the elderly living off their nest eggs. But what is important to underscore is that wealth and income together do provide a better portrait of what it means to have financial stability in the United States. Wealth, or net worth, is the value of assets owned by a family, such as a home or a savings account, minus outstanding debt, like a mortgage or student loans. Accumulated over time, wealth is a source of retirement income, protects against short-term economic shocks, and provides security and social status for future generations. The period from the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s was beneficial for the wealth portfolios of American families overall. House prices more than doubled in this period, and stock values tripled. As a result, the median net worth of American families climbed from $94,700 in 1995 to $146,600 in 2007, a gain of 55%. Sounds pretty good, right? Right?
Major sectors of America's financial system are at risk of shutting down.
Well, home prices plunged starting in 2006, triggering the Great Recession in 2007 and dragging stock prices into a steep free fall as well. Consequently, the median net worth of families fell to $87,800 by 2013, a loss of 40% from the peak in 2007. And as of 2016, the last year for which data is available, the typical American family had a net worth of $101,800. Still less than what it held in 1998. To put it bluntly, middle-income families saw their net worth decline by 20%, and low-income families, 45% on average. That's devastating. But on the flip side of things, upper-income families had the opposite outcome, building on their wealth from 2001 to 2016, adding 33% at the median. Why? The reason for this shrinkage is that middle-income families are more dependent on home equity as a source of wealth than upper-income families, and the bursting of the housing bubble in 2006 had much more of an impact on their net worth. Upper-income families derive a larger share of their wealth from financial market assets and business equity. and thus they were in a better position to benefit from a relatively quick recovery in the stock market once the recession ended. For most middle-class Americans, their home is their biggest financial asset. Not a savings account, not a retirement account, not stock investments. But that's not necessarily the case in Germany. Here, only 46% of households own, or partially own because of a mortgage, their main residence. Germany has high transfer taxes on buying real estate, no mortgage interest tax deductions for owner-occupiers, and a social housing sector with broad eligibility requirements. And all of these features potentially tilt incentives towards renting. Okay, fair warning. This is a disclaimer that a lot of microanalysis on net worth for German households doesn't really exist. There aren't a lot of studies that examine this middle class in Germany like there are for American households. What we do know is that there are a lot of studies that look at the entire economic picture for the whole society. So we can look at things like averages and medians. And while that's not exactly a good one-to-one comparison, it does give us a ballpark at least, because again, this middle income group does take up a sizable chunk of the German population. But just a disclaimer as we move forward that these figures are going to be a little bit rough. For 10 years now, the Bundesbank has been surveying households in Germany about their wealth, debt, and income, and the results are actually pretty surprising. At 316,500 euros in nominal terms, average net wealth reached a new record high since the launch of the survey 10 years ago. Median net wealth, which marks the middle of the wealth distribution and divides households into a richer half and a poorer half, also swelled considerably, rising from 70,800 euros in 2017 to 106,600 euros in 2021. However, it should be mentioned, the wealthiest 10% of households still continue to hold 56% of total net wealth. So if Germans aren't buying homes nearly as often, then how instead are they choosing to invest in this pretty sizable net worth? Well, households appear to have a broad preference for liquid and lower risk forms of investment. And this is evident in the share of households with savings accounts, which are held by 71% of households in Germany. And households' financial assets went up from an average of 56,800 euros to 77,900 euros between 2017 and 2021. So putting all of those numbers aside, I really wanted to understand, how does someone live if you're in the middle class in the United States versus Germany? How is that experience and how is it different? Well, again, I have to preface this entire section with the disclaimer, it depends, especially since the middle class encompasses a pretty wide range of household incomes, and since property costs are highly location dependent in both countries. The housing market in the US and in Germany has cooled slightly over the last year. But that doesn't mean that it isn't still pretty difficult to buy a home, and the market can actually be pretty cutthroat in some cases.
A piece of advice to millennials: you should postpone the American dream of home ownership.
In the United States, that confluence of trends has taken the dream of home ownership well beyond the means of middle-class Americans, who are increasingly up against higher-income buyers for a smaller pool of homes. And this is a crisis I think we really need to be careful with. For most Americans, owning a home is key to their vision of success. It's a foundational piece of the American dream. It can help families create financial platforms for future generations to build on, but about 75% of homes currently on the market are out of reach for those in the middle class. Nonetheless, the American middle class, at least to those living the lifestyle, has become known around the world for conspicuous consumption. To this day, the professional middle class, often pegged as the upper middle class in the United States, holds the world record for having the largest homes, the most appliances, and the most automobiles. Now, this is just sort of more of an antidote as my observation as an American, but I would tend to agree that for many Americans in the middle class, defining yourself as being in the middle class is basically having all of those markers, owning a home, having a couple of cars, and hopefully being able to go on vacation once a year. Granted, that house might not be new and those cars might not be paid off depending on where you fit on that middle class scale, but yeah, there's a certain amount of lifestyle that's involved in considering yourself part of this middle class group that, again, is defined by consumption. But it appears that that might be actually less the case here in Germany. Because renting in Germany is much more protected and the upfront cost of buying is so steep, owning a home doesn't necessarily hold the same placeholder as a marker of middle class like it does in the US. And since Germans live more densely and there's much more of a robust public transit system, a middle-class family is likely to maybe only own one car instead of two. But what I find to be abundantly interesting is that instead of spending their money on buying homes, Germans tend to take that money and put it into savings accounts, into topping up their retirement plans, and into other investments. And yeah, taking maybe a little bit longer of vacation on places that are a touch more exotic. And granted, this data is a little bit dated, but it's fascinating nonetheless. Germans have, on average, 1,020 euros per person available for holiday travel in 2017. This equates to almost 5% of Germans' total 2017 purchasing power. And as such, Germans' average annual expenditures for holiday travel significantly surpass spending on automobile purchases. That's right. They're probably going to spend more on a vacation than a car. But I think in many zip codes in both the US and Germany, things aren't as easy as they used to be, particularly for the middle class. And I think for a lot of people, that financial security that used to be standard for this level of attainment and living and income seems to be more of an illusion than a reality. For Americans, they may have more money in the bank, but being middle class in the US isn't only about how much money you make. It's about what you can buy with that money. Some people measure that by whether a family has a second refrigerator in the basement or a tree in the yard. But what really matters is whether people feel that they can comfortably afford the 3 H's: housing, healthcare, and higher education. In the past year alone, home prices have leaped 20%, and the cost of all goods is up 8.5%. And that squeeze has left many who identify as middle class reaching to afford those 3 H's, especially housing. And such is the same in Germany as well, especially when you look at sentiment from one generation to the next. For example, the size of the middle class in Germany has decreased from generation to generation since the baby boomers. In their 20s and 30s, 71% of baby boomers belonged to the middle class, but only 61% of millennials do. Young people are thus disproportionately affected by this decline in the middle class. And part of this is due to the fact that the middle class is being affected by the polarization of the German labor market. For example, there was a relative decline in occupations with a medium level of competence, while there was a relative expansion in occupations with high and low levels of competence. By 2030, even greater polarization is expected. I think it's really interesting to think about how things are going to pan out for the middle class in the coming decades. If current trends hold and the middle class continues to shrink, basically we're going to see a bigger divide between the haves and the have-nots. And the middle class, which was once and still is a backbone of the economy in both countries, what happens to that if that disappears? What does the future look like in both countries? But I would love to hear from you about what you think about how easy or difficult it is to reach for, attain, and keep this middle class designation in your neck of the woods. How do you think it feels to be middle class where you live? What does that look like? What does that feel like? And do you think things are getting better or getting worse? Let me know down in the comment section below. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from S𝗨𝗣𝗣𝗥𝗧, hit that subscribe button. So I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss!